As I listened to this morning's presentation by Dr. Wolterstuff, I thought very much about my presentation in terms of the agent and the recipient, and what Dr. Wolterstuff talked about in terms of deep listening for dignity. I think that that is part of what my work and my project is about. To hear and document the story of a Luba Congolese Christian community that risked their lives for peace, for friends, for guests, for strangers, and for neighbors throughout the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo and afterwards. As I listened to them, I actually set out to write a kind of a standard academic book in the beginning, but I changed my mind about that and decided that what I needed to do was simply document and tell their story in words that they could then identify with. And so the story that I'm currently writing does not have academic interpretation to it. It has a narrative. It's a narrative of what they did that will then go back to them, it will be approved by them, and then published in that form first before I move on to academic interpretation. So I have not put this story in relationship with academic literature thus far, but I am going to cross that line a bit this afternoon, just a bit. In preparation for this panel, I pondered the question of tensions between norms of justice and other norms as these tensions have appeared in my research in the Democratic Republic of Congo. My thought led me away from the usual debate between international norms of human rights, especially civil and political rights versus social and economic rights, or international norms of human rights and cultural norms related to family and religion. But rather, for this short, very circumscribed presentation, I was struck by the way in which a Christian norm, particularly that there are times when a Christian may be called to lay down their lives for their friends, is at odds with what we usually think about as human rights norms. This norm is, as Lois Wilson said this morning, and as my interviewees have also said, an act of salvation. It is a way of saving people. For some, this exercise of this norm was a decision of human dignity that sought to prevent further violence. For other people, particularly women and children who were in the community, who were made vulnerable by the decisions of others through no decision of their own or conscious decision to participate or place to flee, there might be an argument made that their human rights had been violated by this decision. So it is that very limited challenge and discussion that I'm going to focus on today. The Democratic Republic of Congo is a large, diverse country with major metropolitan areas in the west and in the south, a volatile war zone, which you see where it borders Rwanda, Uganda, and Burundi, vast expanses of inhabited but isolated towns and villages. Little is reported from the interior, as journalists don't go there. And yet the dynamics of war affected most of the country, either by direct violence or by the need to care for internally displaced people who fled to areas of the country where there wasn't active conflict. My community, Kamina, under the leadership of the church, cared for 30,000 displaced people within and at the edge of the war zone and engaged in direct peace-building activities with the Mai Mai militias. My book begins with this scene in the orphanage related by the woman here in the red dress and roughly on the area that's adjacent to the picture at the left, at the right. Here's what I've written. Mama Mujing felt his presence across the interior playground in the center of the orphanage. She crept close to the wall leading to the door to the children's sleeping quarters, her face lowered, her spine hunched, her hands gripping a 10-gallon bucket of water. She dared not stare at terror, and yet she lifted her head ever so slightly to the side and peeked, searing the remarkable image into her brain. There ambled Chinja Chinja, the famous Mai Mai warlord, his hair long and flowing, his body wrapped in animal skins, his side adorned with spears, his neck weighted with a lace that bound together human genitalia. Chinja Chinja, whose name translates slain, slain, commander of 6,000 warriors who carried out his vicious commands. Chinja Chinja, who, by the persuasive powers of the bishop and his clergy, agreed to attend the peace conference where the governor hoped to bring the Mai Mai threat to an end. Chinja Chinja, who, for the next 5 days, would eat, live, and consult his ancestors for guidance through his deadly rituals, here in a building of the orphanage in the back of Mama Mujing's compound. Meanwhile, Mama Mujing and the widows who staffed the orphanage, women displaced by the war, would feed, cuddle, and calm the fears of 54 war orphans who were now contained in the one building close to the front entrance. While Chinja Chinja consulted his spirits, Mama, the widows, and the children would pray to their God, hoping their God was stronger. Mama's gospel tells the story of one man who lays down his own life for his followers. After his death, he is entombed with boulders sealing the entrance. Some women rise early the next morning to dress his body with herbs and ointments. They discover the tomb is empty and his body is gone. This tragic story has a miraculous ending. This man appears in visions around which his followers regather. They hear that they too may be asked to die in love for others. Mama Mujing would have been one of the women who discovered Jesus' empty tomb. She would have been one prepared to die in martyrdom. But nowhere do Mama's scriptures say that church leaders may pledge the lives of 54 innocent children as collateral for peace. Nowhere do the scriptures say that religious authorities may hold hostage the women and children of an entire city of 100,000 people. And yet, by convening the Mai Mai Peace Conference in Kamina, the church had, in effect, done just that. Since 1999, militia violence had controlled the countryside around Kamina for hundreds of kilometers to the north, east, and west. In September 2004, the church at Kamina, at the request of the government, convened Mai Mai warlords, military officials from Kamina military base, government leaders, traditional chiefs of the Luba tribe that dominates the area, and interfaith religious authorities in the hope of bringing the threat to an end. This rural city had resisted the war in Congo and strained its meager resources to care for 30,000 displaced people. Now it would be put to its greatest test. If Kamina failed and the peace conference endangered the lives of the hated Chinja Chinja and the other Mai Mai warlords, the innocent children of the orphanage might well be the first to die. The religious practices of Mama Mujing and Chinja Chinja are written into the first scene. The data in my interviews suggests that in all decisions for violence and peace in the DRC, religion functions as a motivating force. Yet political, scholarly, and journalistic analyses of the war ignore religion as a motivating factor. Yet these analyses are rife with human rights discourse. The disparity leads me to two questions. Is human rights discourse a civic religious discourse that obscures the fundamental spiritual and religious Congolese culture, a quality of culture that must be understood and enabled in order to build an enduring peace? And does human rights discourse contribute to the secular attitude that religion is either an impotent or negative power that promotes violence but cannot be tapped for peace building? And I will say I raise these questions hesitantly because I actually think human rights discourse is very important in the Congo, and it's also very important to the people I've interviewed. But first, for those of you who aren't familiar with this war, here's some background. It is considered Africa's World War. There were 7 African nations directly involved in the fighting, as well as others in the background. It was about lots of different things: conflict minerals and arms trade, ethnic division between Bantu and Nilotic tribes rooted in colonialism, tribal rivalries associated with governmental power, especially in the transition from Mobutu to Kabila, scarcity and food when soldiers weren't paid and turned to villagers for food and water, and then a challenge of belief about indigenous religion and who kept tradition the best, the Mai militias or the traditional chiefs. There was ongoing political peace process efforts and negotiations led by a number of African countries, two in particular that are very important. One is the Lusaka ceasefire agreement, where a number of negotiations came to a head, and then when that one didn't succeed, the Sun City Agreement, which finally did begin to bring the belligerents back to their own countries. In the midst of all of that, there were various kinds of local peace building efforts that occurred. Because of the particular issue that I want to raise here, I want to focus on the relationship between the political peace processes and the Mai militias. Mai militias originally developed in the 1970s in response to the army's defense of Mobutu. Mobutu's army was allowed to rob and loot villages with impunity, and the militias grew up as local defenses against that army kinds of action. They died down. When the coup against Mobutu occurred, when Kabila came back in the country, they were re-encouraged. And in the beginning, they did defend the citizenry, but then they became what the Congolese call a good movement gone wrong. And that was that they eventually then turned against the citizens and against the villagers themselves, and they were as feared as any other force in the country. Why did this happen? It happened because they were very young, they were armed, they were under the influence of hallucinatory drugs, and they were getting increasing amounts of power that allowed them to challenge the traditional structures of authority in the tribes. One of those structures of authority is that the chief is supposed to allow access to territory by judging whether a cause is just or not. When Kabila came in to overthrow Mobutu, the chiefs allowed the Kabila and his forces to come in without hesitation. When the Mai militias came, they said, no, you are not acting justly. The chiefs held up a challenge, there became a fight, and a number of the traditional chiefs were killed in the course of that. So between 2000, actually, when the peace process is beginning to take off, in 2004, the militias in the rural areas gained lots of territory, lots of swaths of territory that were under their control. And they had not been part of the political peace process, but in order to even hold elections, there had to be some kind of dealing with the militias. The militias are, the Mai militias are very religious. They are almost like religious fundamentalists in some respects, as I think about them in relationship to culture in Congo. The traditional chiefs do have an element of critical thinking that goes on in relationship to indigenous religion, but the Mai militias were known for not wanting to be challenged. They had their own traditions, they carried on their own ceremonies, they believed their traditions were the most important ones. They opted for the traditions related to power in indigenous religion that included cannibalism. We'd call it cannibalism for them. It was a matter of eating the flesh of the opponent in order to be able to imbibe the power of the opponent. That's the logic that goes with it, as well as washing that with either water or blood that allows a kind of protection, which is widely believed in that area. They are people who can be interpreted in relationship to the terms of retributive justice or reactive justice. That is a stance toward life. How do we find out who has done something wrong and hold them accountable for that? And that largely happens through ceremonies and the guidance of ancestors as they understand it. Human rights language does not help us interpret Mai militias and why they do what they do. It doesn't help us understand their logic. But spiritual leadership does. And they do understand the power of spiritual leadership as something that they adhere to and that they understand. And so that there is an element of another spiritual leader being able to talk to this form of fundamentalism, if we want to talk about it that way, the way Aziz Sashidina talked about it this morning, as talking to a religious fundamentalist on his or her own terms. And so the church leaders in this conference were able to do that. They understood the logic, they knew indigenous religion, they were able to talk to the Mai leaders in their terms, and therefore be able to gain a level of understanding about why they did, well, not gain, they understood why they did what they did, be able to help them move on to a different kind of behavior. Why is the international community and the Congolese culture so much at odds about trying to understand what's going on here? I really tried to wrestle with this and the logics that I uncovered as I talked to people. And I think that there is a logic in the Congolese culture, in the rural Congolese culture, and a logic in the kinds of documents I read in the international press, in the scholarly documents, in the political analyses, in documents coming out of NGOs and that sort of thing, that goes something like this, which tells us why we miss each other. In the rural Congolese culture, tribal chiefs or Christian leaders or other religious leaders are those people who have credible authority. In other words, they can motivate change internally. The national, provincial government and law is gaining authority and seen to have power and can motivate change externally. The new constitution and human rights discourse also are seen as categories of rising authority. The Congolese soldiers and militia don't have authority, but they have power. And MONUC, of course, the United Nations peacekeeping force, originally had a lot of authority, is declining in authority, but has a lot of power. In contrast, in the international community, I think the human rights discourses in MONUC has the most authority. Individual government officials are gaining authority. The national and provincial government and the military is seen to have power but has little authority, is given little credibility. And I think Christian leaders and tribal chiefs have almost no authority when it comes to the international community. So this is why it seems to me that spiritual leaders may succeed but may be well overlooked by the international community, if I'm right about this analysis. For Congolese persons, decisions about violence and peace are religious decisions, as I've said, based on rituals and ceremonies, guidance of ancestors, whether you talk about the communion of saints or the ancestors in a traditional ceremony, and based on spiritual authority. That is written all over the interviews I've done. But for the international community, violence, peace, and justice is based in a civic religious discourse. In other words, the human rights discourse, I believe, is something that people look to explain why people engage in violence or peace. An example of this is that in the current literature, or in the current kind of news releases that happen, the highest priority is on bringing criminals to the International Criminal Court in The Hague. That is where you see more language at the current moment, as if, and I don't want to say that it shouldn't happen, it should happen, but as if this could solve the problems of violence. And yet there are so many perpetrators of this kind of violence that there has to be another way to unwrap the violence and to bring a different kind of behavior about. On the other hand, I will say that when I read the newspaper articles, scholarly articles, political articles and stuff, there is very little concern for some of the kinds of violation of human rights discourse that we heard from Dr. Wolterstorff this morning, especially concerning demeaning, and I will add operating in stereotypes or shaming, that this happens in relationship to Congolese persons in the international press all the time. Okay, I want to go back to my first case study. This is a picture of the leadership of the Kamina Mai conference. What happened there that led to a measure of success? The community had been prepared by pastors who were preaching sermons on nonviolence from July to August to September when the conference occurred. They were preparing the community for something that would happen. The community was called by the government and did all of the hosting of logistics, housing, food, transportation, and therefore did it in a very culturally appropriate way respecting the practices of the various people who would participate. There are dramatic stories of certain individuals who risked their lives in order to go to the warlords, especially Chincha Chincha, to persuade them to participate, knowing that government officials had already gone and had already been killed in trying to do this negotiation. And yet they believed that because of their kinship, their village relationship, and because of the guidance of God, that they could do this and they could survive, and they did. Then, during the actual conference, every effort was made by the religious leaders to respect religious practice and rituals and provide safety for all of the participants. And I would say that these four items probably summarize why this conference succeeded and, frankly, did not blow up. The religious leaders were very fearful the night before it began that that's exactly what would happen. The place where there's I guess I would say, where if we used human rights language to interpret what happened at this conference, we would have to say there would have been quote unquote violation of human rights would be the vulnerable people who were put at risk throughout the community, not in just the dramatic situation in the orphanage, but throughout the community, who had nowhere to flee, no choice in the matter, and nowhere else to go. So one of the questions is, to what extent was this a success? I would call it a success because there were a number of different warlords who participated, and out of the agreements that came out of the conference, the warlords did release the roads. They went back, they conducted their ceremonies, they got the ascension of their own ancestors to give up their arms, trade them for bicycles, that sort of thing. In the international press, the one reference I've seen to Kamina is that it was a resounding failure because Chincha Chincha eventually was arrested. He did go back to his ways. He moved to another part, went back to his ways, and was arrested by the Congolese government. On the other hand, a number of the other forces in the area, a number of the other militias were integrated into the society, and in that sense, it was a success. If I go back to the original premise about the way in which human rights discourse and religious discourse is at odds here, there is this norm of laying down your life for your friends in very extraordinary circumstances, not one that we want to hold up as an ordinary time norm, obviously, but one that is called upon in the Christian tradition. On the other hand, there is the norm of human respect and dignity that we heard about this morning, and these would have to do with human rights, inherent in human rights to participation in this kind of a process. If I analyze the interviews of people who were at this event, I can find, I could go through the interviews as I was listening this morning, find language of justice and rights in their form of duty and obligation and virtue and benevolence. All of that kind of reference is there. When I look at the people who are on the recipient side, not the agential side, but the recipient side, the language of human rights really fails me in terms of interpreting their participation. But religious narrative holds multiple instances of vulnerable women and children who have a role in what we would call salvation, and that there is a moral significance for women and children as participants in this larger religious narrative. And I can use that language to interpret what they did in this situation. So even though I would argue, as others have today, that human rights, justice, and religious language are interrelated languages, I would want to make a parallel argument to what we heard this morning, and that is that if justice needs human rights as a part of its language, or human rights needs justice, then in addition to that, the human rights language also needs religious narratives in order to interpret what it does too. That these are languages that complement one another but cannot be replaced by one another. Thank you very much.